Mind Your Farm Business on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank.
Welcome to the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. I'm Sean Haney, founder of RealAgriculture.com. This podcast is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. I want to thank them for their continued sponsorship of these podcasts. You can find more Mind Your Farm Business content by going to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. Okay, today's topic is a little bit different, yet very, very important. We're going to talk today about public trust and how it actually fits into our farm business. Now, you're probably asking, okay, I've heard this word public trust, but what does this actually mean? Today's guest is Crystal MacKay. She's with the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. If you go to their website at foodintegrity.ca, it says consumers have questions about food, where it comes from, who's producing it, and how. Their healthy curiosity and skepticism is why we exist. The website continues by saying, we simply want to make sure that consumers in an environment where they are bombarded with contradictions have the balanced information they need about food to make informed choices that are right for them and their families. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this whole topic of public trust. It's going to be a fun one today on Mind Your Farm Business. I know you're going to enjoy it. Let's get on to our guest, Crystal MacKay from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. Crystal, how's it going?
Great, Sean.
Okay, so typically in the Mind Your Farm Business podcast, we talk about financial ratios, accounting, managing risk. The last episode was all about HR plans. Today we're going to talk about public trust. And we're going to start off right away with the question that probably a lot of the listeners it's going through their mind. Why would public trust actually fit into a business podcast related to farming? What is the why to the whole scenario and the discussion around public trust?
Great question, Sean. And it's absolutely a new way to think about public trust and where it fits in Canada. It absolutely is a business risk that needs to be managed by the whole agri-food system, starting at the farm and going right up to our biggest retail and food service partners. So if you think of it like this, public trust is a base that allows us to grow, to innovate, and expand, whether it's here at home or, for illustrious export market demand.
Okay, so when we talk about risk, when I hear you describe that, I know what the value of wheat or corn or soybeans is today. How do I actually measure this risk of public trust then?
Well, that's the tricky part of this public trust business. I mean, at Centre for Food Integrity, we do measure levels of public trust in different topics like environment, animal welfare, food safety, and the whole Canadian food system, trust in farmers, trust in government. But how does that translate to a business? And I guess the best way to measure public trust, unfortunately, is if you lose it. So the most real example of losing public trust and social license in Canada is the fact we weren't allowed to build pig barns in Manitoba for 8 years. So that's not just a pork industry thing. That means you don't double pork exports, you don't double your plant, you don't double your seed and feed and combine sales, everything that would have went into doubling pork exports from Manitoba when you're not allowed to build a barn. So it's tough to measure the value of public trust until you really lose it in terms of the business impact. But there's definitely enough case studies, starting in the EU, going into the US, and then that one I mentioned in Canada, that we can see what happens if you don't have it.
So is this one of those scenarios where, we hear this a lot with respect, where, it takes forever to build it, but you can lose it in just a second? Is that sort of like public trust, or is it different?
Well, I would say it definitely is. Like our vision statement at Centre for Food Integrity is helping the food system earn trust. It's absolutely something you have to keep working at. It's a long-term vision. It can absolutely be eroded with some specific crisis communications events if they're not managed correctly. I don't think you would go from 100 to 0 with one event, but you will absolutely be judged on how you're managing it. So I consider it kind of like the public trust credit bank. We should be continually putting credits in the public trust credit bank, knowing that with Mother Nature, people, equipment, something's going to go wrong. Something's going to happen, and then you'll be judged on how you deal with that. But if you start at a negative number, it's just going to keep going down.
And I think another piece of this whole discussion that is really hard to get your head wrapped around is, what is that benchmark? What is that level? Because I find that in some cases that the the level we're trying to achieve in public trust is actually going up, and in maybe some cases it's going down, but it's an ever-changing, flowing. It's not static. It's very dynamic.
Absolutely. So, for example, the overall impression and trust in agriculture and farmers is at a record high. We've got some tracking data going back to 2006. But even still, record high, using air quotes that you can't see, obviously, on a podcast, is still getting us to 61%. So compared to other sectors like forestry or oil and gas, a 61% positive rating is pretty great, and it is a record high in 20 years of tracking. But you wouldn't go home and brag about a 61% to your parents on your report card. So obviously, I would look at it as a continuous improvement, a continuous investment. It's a new part of our bottom line that we all need to think about.
Does public trust, does it have any impact on the price at the farm gate? That probably depends on the kind of commodities you're selling. I imagine if you're selling to farmers markets, that's different than if you're shipping canola to the local elevator. But I imagine that's kind of a hurdle for some producers to get their head wrapped around. Why do I need to care about this if it doesn't have a direct impact on the price I'm getting?
Yeah, I would look at it as public trust can start off as a premium on a branded product or a product with adjectives where the money's always in the adjectives, and then it'll turn into a discount if you don't have it. Or, the worst scenario is you won't be allowed to operate at all. So I would say we see it in things like labeling claims. So raised without antibiotics would be the biggest trend that we're seeing right now. So the fact that the public has a high level of concern around antibiotics in food, it's not a coincidence. Then we see claims raised without antibiotics. So then back to the farm, you would get a premium and or contracts based on that type of production system. The same thing could be said for non-GMO. There's a premium attached with that to start, and then it could turn into no access to market or reduced access to market and or a discount if you don't achieve what they're looking for.
Before we get to the rest of our conversation with Crystal MacKay from the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, let's get a word from our sponsor.
This episode of the Mind Your Farm Business podcast is brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. While there is no way to eliminate all business risks you'll face, creating a sound risk management strategy will help mitigate some of the more common ones and give your business a leg up. The agriculture banking specialists at RBC Royal Bank can help set your farm up for success. Visit rbc.com/agriculture to find an ag specialist near you.
Okay, Crystal, continuing on. So is today's public trust the old social license, or are those two different things?
It is, yeah. Well, it's bigger than social license, but I've personally worked really hard on advocating for the shift to public trust away from social license. Social license is the notion of having freedom to operate without restrictions, which is a great aspirational goal, but it's absolutely not realistic. So the oil industry started that in the late 90s, and obviously, how's that working out for you? So we actually did some work with consumers to test the concept of social license, and the highest rating out of 100 that we got on social license was to farmers on the environment, and that was only a 28%. So the concept of even trying to get to a 50% passing grade it's an unrealistic goal. So the real goal here is if we have public trust in food and the people that produce it, that is the base that then you can continue to operate and hopefully expand and innovate and do all the exciting things we have the potential to do in Canada.
Now, you mentioned that the trust with farmers is very high. Is there a certain area of agriculture that does better at managing public trust in your evaluation, or do you sort of just look at the sector as a whole?
Well, our work today looks at the sector as a whole, so farmers in general. We do have some trending data that shows farmers by different types, and there's definitely a divide on whether or not an animal has to be killed to produce your product. So at the top of the list would be grains and vegetables and fruits, and then dairy, and then it would start going down from there, down to fur and veal near the bottom. So there is definitely, pardon the pun, pecking order in terms of opinion and trust on the types of farms, but recognizing all of that is opinion based on no subject matter expertise. It's just a perception of the sector. Okay,
let's get to the how. How do I leverage public trust to benefit not only my sector as a whole, but my individual farm?
Mm-hmm. So we are in a really great position with public trust in Canada that 50% of our population is unsure what to think, even though they have good respect and trust for farmers and what we do in providing their food. So the opportunity is here to say we need to be louder with our messaging, whether it's your own farm brand or your associations that you work with, to really put that Canadian flag or your provincial flag and your personal farm flag and your personal family flag, and I say flag, but branding on everything that we do, to say Canadian consumers want food grown close to home by Canadian farmers. And so there's no reason why that messaging couldn't be louder and stronger to show that we are already providing that. They just don't know it yet.
Interesting. So when you, and I know you've done some work with the Center for Food Integrity in the U.S., when we combine public trust in Canada in agriculture versus other countries, how are we faring there in comparison?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So I can definitely speak to the U.S. in detail, and we are actually doing a little bit of homework on comparing to the EU and the UK specifically, but I don't have that info in my head yet. But on the U.S. comparison, there is definitely a difference. Starting with the big picture, in the U.S., the opinions around food and farming are already more polarized, so more pro and against and less in the middle. In Canada, we're still, 50% of us are unsure what to think, whether it's environment or food safety or animal welfare. They're unsure, but positive. This is the opportunity because we see the trend lines move from the U.S. to Canada. They're not dotted lines. They're absolutely solid lines. So what are farmers and our food system partners going to do differently so people don't get polarized into negative? We want to move them for sure to positive.
Okay, so we hear lots about, the how, the why to do this and the how, but one of the questions is like, who owns this relationship with the consumer? And what responsibility does the farmer have versus other members in the value chain to build and maintain this level of public trust with these farm and ag commodities?
Great question. So this concept of public trust has been very divisive. So organizations, commodities, individuals have all stepped up and been doing their own things. And what our work shows is it's very much the whole food system needs public trust. So from, my dad, the farmer in the Ottawa Valley, through to the CEO of the biggest restaurant chain in the country, we all need public trust. So this concept of tribal communications, there are 30,000 conversations happening about food and farming right now. Chances are good farmers aren't part of it. So what can we do better to make sure that credible farm content gets into those existing conversations and actually providing resources and investment to make sure that happens? Not just, every person can reach 30, 300 people, but what is it going to take to reach 30 million? And that's going to take investment from the whole supply chain, starting on the farm, all your suppliers, right through to who you sell to, your customers up the value chain. It needs to be a much bigger commitment and investment that the whole food system can own better together.
Okay, Crystal, thanks a lot for joining us here on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast.
Thanks, Sean. Have a great day.
I want to thank Crystal MacKay from the Canadian Center for Food Integrity for being our guest today on the Mind Your Farm Business podcast. Like I said in the opening, you can find out more about their organization by going to foodintegrity.ca. And I think one of the things we heard today is there really is this connection with the consumer. We talk all the time in our industry about we need to connect with them. We need to understand the consumer. We need to make sure that we're meeting their demands. And a part of all of that communication and that connection is establishing trust. And how do you make sure that you're managing the risk of a public trust violation or taking advantage of public trust opportunities to really benefit your farm business? For more episodes of Mind Your Farm Business, go to mindyourfarmbusiness.com. I want to thank our sponsor, RBC Royal Bank. And until next time, keep on minding your farm business.